Hello, everyone, and welcome to Frontier Talk, the world's first podcast on decentralized identity. I'm Raj Hegde, and in this podcast, we explore the intersection of identity, people, and technology. Digital identity is a representation of you on the internet. It essentially is any personal data that can be traced back to you. Over the last 3 decades, my guest on the pod today has worked tirelessly to break new ground and establish a user-centric identity layer for the internet. He is a pioneer who has penned some of the most widely used identity standards on the internet today and has centered his energy around the trifecta of identity, user-centricity, and privacy. Here to share his take on the symbiosis of decentralized identity and user-centricity, Nat Sakimura, chairman of the OpenID Foundation. Sakimura-san, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the pod today.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this venue. I'm really pleased to join you.
Likewise, the honor is all mine, Sakimura-san. For our audience, I highly urge you guys to stick around till the end of the episode because we have a little surprise in store for you. So anyways, let's get started. So Nat, you've established yourself as a global expert in the field of identity. What originally drove you to specialize in this space?
All right. So that was a little bit personal thing. My daughter had a surgery, which was a failure. And at the time, I desperately needed access to her medical record, but I wasn't able to. There was no legislation like that as well. So I dipped my feet in this field, right, to make it possible for people to get their own data, or their, family's data. And, for that, digital identity was actually kind of essential, especially when we want to get it from the remote site.
Okay, I mean that's quite inspiring. And for our audience, could you perhaps shed some light on the work that OpenID Foundation does? What essentially is the OpenID Foundation, and could you perhaps expound on your role as chairman of the foundation?
Okay, so OpenID Foundation is it's a non-profit organization which is specialized on the standardization, the international standardization of digital identity and API access management. We have created, our main product is something called OpenID Connect, right? It's a standard which is being used by a lot of places, from big techs to the companies to the small guy like me is running my own identity server since 2011.
Right.
So that's the core product, and we are actually creating, the profiles, add-ons, and things like that, which makes it easier and more secure for people to transact on the internet.
Right. And could you perhaps talk a bit about OpenID Connect? Essentially, what role does it play on the internet today?
So, internet, unfortunately, came out without the notion of identity.
Okay.
And, by identity, I mean the set of attributes, right? It's going to be used to recognize one person or one entity. It doesn't really matter whether it's a person or it's a process, both of things, something like that. But to make the internet environment safer to transact, you really need to be able to find out who you are actually talking to, right? You need to be able to authenticate the other party. And to do so, we need to gather a bunch of characteristics, which we call as attributes or claims from the other parties, right? And evaluate if that's trustworthy enough. So OpenID Connect is essentially doing that. We call it Selective Attribute Disclosure Protocol.
Okay.
So it actually allows you to express yourself as having a set of attributes we call it claims, right? Because you're claiming that. Claims.
Absolutely.
Attested by somebody else, usually, because, if it's just self-claimed, it's really hard for the receiving party to believe, right? Usually attested by somebody, and pass it on to the receiving party. So that the receiving party, which we call as relying party, can actually evaluate what's in it and evaluate that it was actually attested by somebody he trusts, or he or she trusts, and the message hasn't been tampered.
Right. Interesting. And
did I make it clear? So
absolutely, no doubts. But I'm curious to know, like, how do you bring about a physical representation of oneself on the internet, particularly at a time when, no such thing exists. There is no identity layer. So how do you come up with standards for something that doesn't really exist at the moment?
Yeah, that's an evolutionary concept, right?
Absolutely,
so OpenID Connect, some people say that OpenID Connect is SAML 3.0 or something like that. So we've been doing that for in iterations for many times, right?
Right.
Started off from the LDAP and things like that, and then we said, "Oh God, okay, we'll do it better next time." And
absolutely, it's always the case.
We repeated that,
in
practice,
Perfect. So before we deep dive into decentralized identity, could you perhaps double click on the concept of digital identity in itself? So what essentially is digital identity today?
So that goes back to the concept of identity, I guess. The concept of identity is actually once, somebody being able to project himself or herself or themselves, right, to other party so that they will have similar perception of yourself. You've got your own self-image, and
Absolutely.
you want the other party, the receiving party, to have the recognition of yourself, which is hopefully more or less the same as your self-image, right?
Absolutely.
Which doesn't really happen because you just can't put electrodes onto the receiver's head and
that is correct. Absolutely.
Make her recognize like that. But so you keep trying it to close the gap between their perception and your perception of yourself, right?
Okay.
And for doing that, you keep providing, you try sending, okay, this time this kind of attributes, like how you behave, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you try another thing and things like that. And you are always adjusting it.
That is correct.
To close the gap, to minimize the gap. And that image is identity, right? It's your identity. That's what you perceive yourself as.
Correct.
And that's how you want the other party to perceive you as.
Mm-hmm.
And the medium to do that is actually the set of attributes that you are going to be providing to the other party.
Correct.
All right. So, in the technical term, in the, IT world, we define identity as set of attributes related to an entity. So set of attributes related to me is my identity. Now, I'm going to have many identities, right?
Correct.
We're going, I have many kind of relationships or contexts, and I choose to provide other sets of attributes to each context or each receiver. But, that's how identity is. And digital identity is a digital representation of that.
Okay. Brilliant. Yeah, you mentioned earlier that, users, people, humans have multiple identities, and the internet in particular makes that possible. So my question to you is, why should people take digital identity seriously? And more importantly, how can they effectively manage these multiple identities on the internet today?
Right. So let's attack the first. Let's address the first question. Why should they take digital identity seriously? Because if you don't have effective digital identity that you can control, you will not be able to express yourself on the internet. That is, you will not be able to exist in the way you want to be in the cyberspace.
Correct.
So unless you really take digital identity seriously, you will not be able to exist in the cyberspace, which is becoming increasingly important in our life, especially in the post-COVID world. Now, the second question is, how can they effectively manage multiple identities? That's a very, very hard question. It's something to do with the user interface and, and the understanding of how it works. But it's really difficult for most people to actually make it out how things work under the hood, right? So as an identity professionals, we have to devise a way in which people can use it intuitively, just like they do in the real world. In the real world, we, keep multiple identities, right? Your face as father, your face as your colleagues, right? These are different facets, different identities, and you do it, without thinking, intuitively.
Correct.
And what we are targeting at is trying to make something like that possible in the digital world as well. Unfortunately, we haven't got there. We even probably don't really know how to do it yet.
Right.
All right. But that's where we are going.
Okay. Right. And as you just mentioned, identity is fragmented today. People have multiple identities. We have multiple identity providers today. There's also, we're also living in an era of centralization with big tech, banks, governments, all sorts of entities, say, vying to become the identity provider of choice. So I see a lot of similarities between the early days of the OpenID Foundation and the decentralized identity community today, so to say. So my question to you would be, how did OpenID aggregate all of these parties into a single ecosystem?
The situation is very different then and now. So you actually have to take it with a grain of salt. But what actually helped to get all the people, all the competitors in one tent was that we were actually trying to be really, really use case agnostic. And we also listened to the market requirements seriously. Right? And our motto then was simple things simple, and complex thing possible.
Okay.
And we made sure that simple thing can be done very simply at the scale. So that kind of attitude seemed to help people to flock to the foundation to create a single standard. Now, this single standard is actually really important because then we will get the benefit of increasing return, right? The benefit from the scales. So that's, I think, what happened at the time.
Right. And the current industry paradigm, as you might know, is that sensitive data is stored in centralized honeypots. We have a finite number of identity providers today, and the implications of having data stored in such honeypots of sorts is that there are irreversible data breaches, data leaks, all sorts of scandals associated with personally identifiable information. My question to you is decentralized identity an antidote to this problem? What's your take on this?
All right. So this, centralized, decentralized dichotomy is a little bit misleading, I think. Mm-hmm. From the user-centricity or, person first kind of point of view, it's more of the control which is important, right?
Absolutely.
So even if the data topology is centralized, if the user is given the control and the provider of the service actually doesn't use it for their purposes, then part of the issues that we are facing right now will be solved. At the same time, if the data topology was completely distributed, still the control was on the provider's side. Mm-hmm. And that's entirely possible, right? Recently, the mobile operating system vendor announced that they are going to look into your phones and search for the things and, remove or report or things like that. That's correct. Entirely possible. So even if the data topology is completely distributed, you still may not establish a desirable amount of control. So that's one aspect that we have to look at from the centralized and decentralized. Mm-hmm. What's important is the control from the quote unquote right kind of side, personal. Right. Right. Now, then you talked about the data breach. Yes, data breach is going to be probably at this moment, kind of more dangerous in the case of centralized data store. The centralized is not really a good word for that. The over accumulation of data, right? Right. Because, it may be, stolen at one go, with one security hole, something like that. But, and currently the network that these things operates, are too slow to be effective, for those, bad guys, probably. But even the other perspective is that if that becomes fast enough, and then even if the data is completely distributed to the mobile phones that people has their own in their hand, perhaps the wallet app, for example, may be correct having a security hole, and the bad guy may be able to extract all the data.
Right. I think some great points there, definitely. I'm curious to know, do you see a future where centralized and decentralized approaches to identity would coexist, or are they two separate entities in their own right?
So, centralized and I've given this talk in a separate forum, but very seldom one technology can completely replace other.
Okay.
Things pile on, right? So the existing infrastructure usually remains for a very long time. And then new infrastructure actually comes on top of it. Mm-hmm. So looking from that pattern, I think for a long time, centralized, quote unquote centralized, right? And decentralized actually probably would coexist. Now, one caveat is that there's no completely centralized system. It's shade of gray.
Right. So my next question to you is, on one hand, we have 1 billion people living without identity today, denying them crucial access to essential financial and social services. While on the other hand, big tech is increasingly correlating information about us today. So my question to you is, does decentralized identity have a role to play in perhaps squaring this circle to widen the access to digital identity?
Sure it does. I mean, so there are people who are denied to have even legal identities, right?
Correct.
And those marginalized people are not interesting enough for commercial entity to provide the identity. So for those people, something like decentralized identity, at least the notion, could become very important. Now, if it's going to be a smartphone wallet type of digital, decentralized identity, I don't know, really. Those people may only have, a very old feature phone, right? Or they may even be lacking good access to network or electricity. So that's something we actually have to consider. Also, we also have to be cognizant that the reason why many of those marginalized people are lacking access to, for example, banking service is not because of big techs, right? Right now, we are fighting against money laundering and terrorism financing. And FATF has put a lot of restriction towards the banking services throughout those. But that has actually driven up the banking costs substantially. I mean, the KYC and, monitoring for the money laundering costs so much. And because of that, onboarding, those, poor people with just $50 a month income to a bank became completely uninteresting from the commercial point of view from the bank. So unless we solve that kind of problem, the onboarding cost problem, the banking service probably will not be provided to those people. So we have to look at those, social aspect as well.
Right.
Just simple technical solution wouldn't work.
Absolutely. That's true. This concept of onboarding, essentially serves as the perfect segue to my next question. I'd like to explore this symbiosis of decentralized identity and user-centricity. Johannes Ernst mentions that any identity interface should make user-centricity as its core proposition. How would you currently describe decentralized approaches to user-centricity today?
I can't claim to know every, decentralized identity scheme, right? It's kind of fragmented right now. So, maybe generalization could be hard. But as I understand, most of the new identity schemes, including OpenID, by the way, is based on the user-centric concept, right? It's the user who decide whether that particular claims or attributes are going to be provided to the relying party. So that's the core concept in most of the those modern identity federation modern identity technologies and decentralized identity technologies. All right. So, there seems to be a lot of, decentralized approach. So I don't claim to know everything. So, the generalization is a bit hard, but, from what I know is that modern identity technologies, even including OpenID Connect, is based on user centricity. That means user is at the core in deciding what attributes are going to be provided to the relying parties. Now, so I'd be very surprised if there are new scheme which actually doesn't allow that to happen.
Correct.
Now, having said that, there's one important point that I would like to make because I'm a consumer advocate as well. Just relying too much on user consent is very, very dangerous because people tend to over-consent. So I'm preaching to most people that user consent actually is a last resort. You should try to use other legal basis if possible.
Okay. Could you perhaps expound on this concept of why people tend to over-consent? I'm curious to know about this.
Right. So there are enough experiments, right? Conducted everywhere in the world. For example, one of the example was that people was asked to agree to the terms of service and provide all their data. And the first item in the terms of service that was that if you agree to this agreement, you agree to give up your son.
Right. Okay.
And what was in return was just a chocolate bar.
Correct.
So they and most people actually agreed, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, asking quote unquote consent to consumer is a bad idea. It's really difficult to get the real consent. I mean, you can have people click yes button, but that doesn't equate consent, right? There are lots of conditions for consent.
Correct.
And one of the condition is that the consenter actually understand what he's doing.
Absolutely. That's one of the most important and fundamental reasons for consenting.
And that's really hard. That's really hard.
Right. That is true.
Right. So, and especially when people are confronted with so many consent screens that they have to press button, it will become a numbing experience. They tend to start clicking yes to everything.
Yeah, that is true. I mean, every time I get an agreement in front of me, like 10, 11 pages, I just click on yes, agree, without even like reading through the agreement. So yeah,
right?
I do agree on that point. It's just behavioral. It's just fundamental to us.
This is just common human behavior.
Absolutely.
And if you actually seriously look at it, it's completely infeasible to read all the, those legal documents. Besides that, most people actually don't have the ability to read it.
Right. All the time.
Legal language is really difficult.
That
right?
is true. Yeah.
Even if you had the ability to do that, I have seen a study that it will actually take full 1 month.
I mean, unless I'm paid by the hour to read through stuff, like I wouldn't even look at legal language, to be honest. Legal lingo has its own little space on the site. So
that's completely infeasible, and it's completely unrealistic to expect that the users actually read through them and understand them and consent.
Right. And
I was talking to one of the big tech guy number of years ago.
Okay.
He was on the identity team, and he was actually fighting against their legal team, right? And their legal team was asking the identity team to get consent for everything that the company wanted to collect.
Right.
And the identity team was saying that, look, the person is clicking yes within 1 second on average.
That is true.
That means that they are not reading it. So it's impossible to assume that they actually agreed.
Correct.
So it's completely wrong to try to collect the quote-unquote consent for all the things that we are trying to obtain. We should minimize the data that we are collecting.
Right.
And just present like 2 or 3 lines of explanation about why they are doing so.
Okay.
Instead of, giving the user 30 pages document.
Yep. I understand. To add to that, what are some of these unsolved gaps that you see in decentralized identity today? One being the consent issue. Anything else that comes to mind?
Consent is one thing. The other thing is that looks to me that they are very much fragmented right now. From the point of view of the running parties, if it is fragmented, it's really difficult to adapt. Fragmentation means that the addressable market segment for each method becomes so small, and it will probably become really difficult for them to justify their investment to implement those. So, I'm wishing that the space will consolidate a little bit. Consolidate doesn't mean the players consolidate, right? It's the standard. If they can come together to like a few options only instead of 94 right now, that's going to be really useful, I think.
Right. You mentioned earlier that the OpenID Foundation essentially was built on the context of being use case agnostic, while on the other hand, in the decentralized identity community, we have a large number of platforms and protocols that solely focus on a specific use case. And taking this user-centricity question in light, what's your take? Should the focus be on a use case in this case, or should it be more focused on human agency, on trying to give more power to the customer, to the end user, to say take control over the identity? Or do you need a mix between the two? What's the right mix here?
So we definitely need to look at the use cases. Even with OpenID Connect, we have looked at many use cases, and we try to solve 80% of use cases.
Okay.
Right? With the single protocol.
Right.
And that's possible, right? You can't solve everything in one protocol. That's for sure, right? But you could try to, build a platform of the protocol which would solve majority of the use cases, right? And then there could be use case specific bits which is not solved by the core protocol itself, right? In that case, you should just build that portion instead of trying to build everything completely separate from others.
Right.
So yeah, the use case is really important. We should be realistic on the use case, but at the same time, like you said, we should achieve that through a core protocol which enables users to take control.
Okay. And speaking about this element of user centricity, do you have any suggestions that platforms in the space could use to say not only onboard more parties and more participants, but also bring the focus or rather move towards being a more user-centric platform, so to say? Because I spend a lot of time with the decentralized identity community. They are it's one of the most passionate communities that I've been a part of, and there's so much to learn from, and they truly want to empower the user at the front. But from a technological perspective, you have issues pertaining to onboarding, private key management and credential management, and so on and so forth. So any tips from your side to navigate such a complex ecosystem at this point in time?
It's really difficult for creating. It's really difficult to create a easy to use user experience, the intuitive user experience, so that people can actually use. We tend to talk within the tech community or nerds, so to speak. And we tend to assume too much capability about the people, but that's probably not the way to go, right? So we need to be quite practical, and so I kind of believe that we need to do a lot of user study, and that can actually be culturally dependent, right?
Okay.
So And I think we don't have enough knowledge and experience on that.
Right. And speaking about practicality, what problems do you think decentralized identity are best suited to solve?
Okay, so that actually depends on the the definition of decentralized identity. But the decentralized identity, as I view as identity information, right? The set of attributes which is being attested by authoritative parties.
Mm-hmm.
There are many authoritative parties in the world. For example, if you want to attest that you have a degree from such and such school, then that school is the authoritative source for that attestation, right? Or if you want to prove that your employment and your position in that company, then that company is the authoritative source.
Correct.
Right? And my view of decentralized identity is that these authoritative sources start issuing those attestations.
Okay.
In a common format. So that the person in the center, like me, can start using them to express themselves.
Right.
So, the COVID passport is just one thing like that.
Mm-hmm.
But what I'm hoping is that the format for, the other format for such thing and the signature and the verification format methods are going to be standardized so that from the implementation point of view and the reader's point of view, it's going to be really easy to consume them.
Brilliant. In our calls earlier, you mentioned that any new technology happens incrementally. So my question to you is, when do you see standardized, decentralized approaches eventually becoming a reality?
The verifiable credential kind of, the attestation side, I think it's going to happen quite soon, in a space of a number of years, right? I mean, to be able to control the flow of those attested claims effectively for majority of the population still needs a little bit of work, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and at the same time, it might end up, but for some portion of the population, somebody like cloud-based service, which may look like centralized from the topology point of view,
Mm-hmm.
but as long as they don't control it and its control is on the user side, I think that's okay and will provide a way for a lot of people to actually make effective control of their attributes or identities on the cyberspace.
Right. So you're pushing for a more hybrid approach to identity.
Yeah,
so
right.
To say.
I mean, the managing private key, is really difficult for most people,
that is
right?
True.
Yeah, I'm on the, extreme side that I tend to everything myself, right?
That is correct.
I do have like a file sharing service of myself.
Mm-hmm.
I do operate my own email server and so on and so forth.
It's crazy.
But I don't expect that, I don't expect most people to be able to do
right.
that.
So scalability would be an issue, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
Yeah.
So the term decentralized is almost always associated with blockchain technology. I'm curious to know, are there any technologies beyond blockchain that focus on decentralized identity?
I think they are orthogonal
Okay.
ideas, right? Blockchain is a technology that can be used to implement decentralized identity.
Mm-hmm.
But decentralized identity doesn't need blockchain. Or decentralized identity can be implemented without blockchain.
So finally, what is the area of innovation that Nat Sakimura is spending most of his time wrestling with at the moment?
So, I'm actually in the process of changing focus a little bit right now.
Okay.
Because I'm pretty much done with the FAPI kind of thing, financial grade API security thing. It's been deployed in UK, Australia, Brazil, soon to be on United States and Canada, and it's being deployed within Russia and so on and so forth. So it's kind of done.
Okay.
To me. And I mean, there are version 2 of it, but there are enough people that I trust who's working on that. So, okay, I'm moving on. Right? And so, what I'm actually, looking at right now is how to express, the trustworthiness of the claims, the attributes, right? So, that's, based on, metadata, like, how it was verified.
Okay.
When it was verified, who verified it, and so on and so forth. That kind of metadata is really important in establishing the trustworthiness of the attested claims.
Absolutely.
And that's the kind of things we are working right now. Also, that extends into the person within the corporation. So we call it the authority claims. But, if you are, for example, you work for KuppingerCole, right? But, and you have certain responsibility and authority within the company.
Correct.
How do you express that? That's a good question, right?
Correct.
So, that's the kind of thing that we are definitely lacking right now.
Right.
So, we have started working on that in, that working group called EKYC and IDA. IDA means identity assurance. So that's one thing. The other thing is that my vision of, identity deployment is that, no one scheme captures everything, or no one scheme is able to take care of everybody.
Okay.
Right. So, I'm currently working on the banking identity. Right. So that, financial institutions can actually serve as a trust anchor for their customer, both individuals as well as the merchant or, companies. And then, hopefully, we can set up a trust framework sort of things for that community, financial community, right? And then, in the developing world, a lot of people, sometimes the majority of the population is unbanked.
That is correct.
So that kind of scheme doesn't work there, right? Then there need to be alternatives for high assurance, trusted identity.
True.
And the most potent candidate for that is mobile identity, right? Like, for example, in Kenya, Safaricom's providing M-Pesa, and that's the de facto, payment mechanism down there, right? So, that can form another, chunk of identity, scheme, so to speak, in that kind of geography. And then, my vision is that, they actually interconnects on the comparability principles so that they can interoperate to each other.
Right.
So we build the islands of those communities and, start, connecting these communities together. So that's something I'm working on. And actually we are making a kind of announcement at the forthcoming European Identity Conference.
Absolutely. We look forward to having you in person at the European Identity and Cloud Conference this year. Some of the stuff that you've mentioned just now sounds incredibly idealistic and inspiring, and I wish you the very best of luck in all of your ventures moving forward. I'm sure you're going to come up with even more groundbreaking stuff, just like how you set up the identity layer of sorts, 2 to 3 decades ago. On that note, it's now time for my favorite part of the show, which is Frontier Fire, where I put my guests on the spot by asking them a series of rapid fire questions. So, Sakimura-san, are you ready?
Okay.
Perfect.
I'll try.
Okay, let's get started. Describe yourself in 3 words.
Identity privacy architect.
Superb. What's your mantra in life?
Look inside.
Okay, very reflective. What important truth do very few people agree with you on?
I don't know if it's important or not, but I'm actually more short-tempered than most people believe. I think.
Really? I mean, you seem like one of the most calmest people out there. Like, at least, in the episodes that I've recorded, it's like it has a very Zen-like feeling today. So I mean, I would find that very hard to believe. So I think that's a great answer, actually. So what's the one skill that has helped you stay a generation ahead when it comes to the field of identity?
Combination of broad view and ability to listen.
Okay. A book you would recommend to our audience?
Brave New World by Aldous Huxley.
Okay. And what's the best piece of career advice you've received?
Invest into yourself.
Okay. And name a person who inspires you.
That was the hard question.
Right. Time is ticking.
Yeah, because a person, right?
Yeah.
I tend to get inspired by everybody I talk to.
Okay.
Right.
So I think you can bypass that question. That's perfectly fine.
Yeah.
Finally, what's your advice to anyone listening to this podcast?
Just like I said in my mantra, try to look inside. Do not be blinded by the flashiness of the surface, right? For example, when blockchain came out, everybody was, going there saying that this saves the world kind of things, which of course is not true. If you really look into it, there are lots of things that we actually, work on. So, it's really important to look at the substance.
Great answer there, Sakimura-san. Right. For our audience, thanks for sticking around this far. As promised, we have a little something for you guys. For those of you who might not know, Sakimura-san is a phenomenal instrumentalist. He plays the flute better than anyone else I know. So, Sakimura-san, what will you be playing for us today?
Okay, so I'm thinking of playing Forest City Land.
Okay.
You guys love it.
We look forward to that. Please, the stage is yours.
All right, so I actually can't play flute here because this is a small place, and I'll start hitting my everything with my flute. So
Right,
I need
true.
to move to another room. So
sure, please.
Okay.
Sakimura-san, I am completely floored. That was an incredible rendition of Sicilian. I'm sure Fore will be smiling up from the heavens today. Thank you so much for considering this request, and thank you again for your time. This conversation was an incredible learning experience for me, and I'm sure our audience today are a lot more wiser about concepts surrounding digital identity and user-centricity. On behalf of KuppingerCole, I wish you the very best of luck in all of your endeavors moving forward, and I'm sure you will continue to break new ground in the identity sphere.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nat.
It was my pleasure to be part of your program.
That was Nat Sakimura. Nat will be delivering a keynote at the European Identity and Cloud Conference, EIC, and you can get your tickets via the link in the description box below. I hope you enjoyed this conversation that dabbled around decentralized identity, the question of user-centricity, and also explored the concept of digital identity. If you enjoyed this conversation, please share this with anyone you might know. We thrive on your feedback, so please post in your comments in the comment section. And until next time, I hope to see you again on this fascinating journey to really find the I in identity. Until next time, stay safe.